How you doing, everybody? I'm Christopher Ian Bennett. Welcome back to the Vancouver Film School Storyteller Studio podcast. One of my favorite guests to come into the studio. I've known Cameron Herold a very, very long time. Cameron is named a man of many names. He has been called the CEO Whisperer. He is a speaker. He is an author. He's truly a storyteller. As an author right now in particular, he's got an incredible book called Free PR. And I want to talk a lot about this with Cameron today and the importance of narrative and storytelling in the way you drive your business and the way you really introduce your brand, whether it's a personal brand or a corporate brand. This is something for decades Cameron has been doing. He was instrumental in building so many companies, from 1-800-GOT-JUNK, College Pro Painters, to some of the biggest corporate names and clients. Some of them you can't even talk about. Some of them you can talk about. Cameron, you're an amazing guy. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Christopher. Appreciate it.
How have you been?
Really well, man. Good.
This book, I love this book. And when I say I love this book, Free PR, I think any company, any human being who wants to understand how to tell their story needs to read this book. We're going to put a link to it in the podcast below so they can check it out. What prompted you to write this story? Because most people assume the opposite. PR is not free. It is costly. It's unknown. Trying to get your story out there is a really difficult thing.
This has been one I've been wanting to write for a long time. It's my 5th book, but this one had a bit of a twist to it now, because I think more than ever, crafting your own personal brand is important, regardless of what role you're at in a company. You know, with we've got the advent of social media in the last 12 years, now having a personal brand and a personal story and kind of your origin story is really powerful.
Yeah.
So I think free PR now is more important than ever for the individual as it was for the companies for a year. Where this book came from, though, was a guy named Vern Harnish. Vern was the founder of the Entrepreneurs Organization. He runs a program called Gazelles and Scaling Up. He told me 10 years ago if I wrote this book, he would put me back on his stage. I wrote 4 other books, and he keeps going, if you write the damn book, I'll put you on the stage. So I'm finally like,
this was the one
I'll get the book done. Yeah.
Did you find that a lot of these are really, you really go deep in this book and you case study them. And this is like, I guess, decades of experience having done this.
This is decades actually having written this book, because this book first started a company called Grasshopper.com. Grasshopper.com sold for well over $150 million, and it was the founder, David Hauser, was an Entrepreneurs Organization member, asked me if I would write the PR manual for him to bring public relations into his company. So I wrote a little manual. It's about 20 pages, and he paid me to write it, and that became the first chapter of my first book. That became the chapter of Double Double. And then over the years, people wanted more information, and I started getting even more practiced at the art of it, and it became the book. So it's been 10 years in the making.
And you've got some stuff in here that I think is really critical for a company or leaders of companies. You talked about origin story being critical, and at VFS, storytelling is foundational to all the stuff we do across every program.
Sure.
I say that a lot because we really, if it's not a good story, you're not going to watch it.
Right.
And yet so many companies don't have a good origin story.
They have one, they just don't know how to tell it.
So you believe every company has one?
Sure, everyone started, right? Every company started somewhere. No one actually maybe wrote it down, no one told the story, but every company had a founder. That founder usually, it's kind of the hero's journey, right? It's the classic story. You would know the model better than I would, but it's that classic kind of, they struggled with something, they kind of quit or started, and then they went through this big journey,
overcoming
and they learned all the
monster
lessons.
kinda.
Yeah, overcoming all this adversity, right?
Yeah.
Every company has that. Vancouver Film School started. Somebody decided to start this, and they were doing something before.
That's right.
Every company can exist. Thomas Edison or Henry Ford or Richard Branson, they all were doing something, and then they started a company. But a lot of the people that we know, they decided to have a story. A lot of people just didn't.
Do you think, when you look at the industry right now from a public relations perspective, the way the media responds to stories that are pitched to them every day, what's your view, what's your perspective on the modern reporter or the modern journalist? Are they lazy? Are they just too busy? Do they need us to feed them these great stories? You've got a really interesting perspective on them in this book, because without them, we can't close that final piece. And yet you're still saying at the core of all these stories, you are the author, you the company.
I almost said lazy as you were saying it, but I don't think that's the right word. I'd rather say they're busy. I think they're just busy. and they're looking for efficiency. They're looking for the path of least resistance. So if we can hand them a good story, they're more apt to think about it and consider that. I always go back to grade 10 creative writing class in school. I forget what the English class was called, but teacher would say, tell a story or write a story. You got 30 minutes. I'm like, about what? Like, if it was write a story about a keyboard or a microphone, I could write a story, but I needed something. I needed an angle, something to talk about. So I think a lot of writers are just busy, and if we can give them a story, they might actually decide to tell that one.
Sure. Do you find that in the companies that you work with now, if they wrap their head around this, is it really how much is free PR versus do-it-yourself PR? Because is there if everyone has an origin story, everyone was started somewhere. There's that story, but now how do you to create life beyond that one story over months, over years? You got to keep coming up with new ones.
Yeah,
can anyone do that?
I'm going to go back to the first question about the writers being lazy, because there's a second part of that I missed, which was I think the media outlets might be a little lazy. Media outlets just don't have the money they used to have. They don't have the money for the investigative journalism. They can't afford to send the reporter out to find a story. So the media outlets are being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed to become more efficient and find stories cheaper. So that might be where I always thought that the reporters were lazy. It's probably more the media outlets are lazier. Now, in terms of the story or finding new stories, I think every company has at least 5 core stories to start with. And then they have one story that can be played out in every single market they do business in. So I'll give you an example of 5 core stories that most companies have. You have your overcoming adversity story, where you struggled and you failed, you made big mistakes. You have your founder story or your origin story and how you started.
Right.
You might have a story about your culture, what your company culture is like, or how you're leveraging technology could be a story. And then you have a story about your customer and how your product or your service changed your customer's life, right? How you cleaned out their home, or you painted their house, or you did a video for them, and how that your work was really powerful for your customer. If you can tell that story in Vancouver, you can tell that same story in Edmonton or Boston or San Francisco or Dallas, or pick a city. So as you kind of expand your company, you can tell that same story city after city after city after city. I don't think it's often as much about finding the new story as it is about not getting bored with telling the same story.
And making sure that you identify all the different audiences that still have yet to hear that story.
That's the other one, right? So if you're going to tell your culture story, let's say we're thinking about a classic business story. You've got Forbes magazine, Fortune magazine, Inc. magazine, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, CNN Money, EO Fire. There's all these podcasts or bloggers. They all have very different viewers, very different readers, very different listeners. So you have to kind of position or spin your story for that audience. And that's very different, right?
Do you have an opinion on, if you look, let's take a company like, I'm just going to pull this out of thin air, Sephora.
Sure.
Okay. A makeup brand.
I don't know why we're talking You've never been into one.
I know. Here we go.
Sitting out in the hallway. Help me. I'm already squirming. Right? I'm like, what the hell am I doing? Where's my water
we may do this one again with a different brand. But let's say you've got a target client, right? Most likely women.
Okay.
I don't know if this will get me into trouble.
Hashtag me too.
Yeah. Doesn't have to be. I want to just say it right. Doesn't have to be. But the idea of makeup. You know who your target customer is. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's important that the narrative or the story you're telling about your company
target that customer?
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to ask is, are you trying to? Is it more effective and is it better storytelling when your origin, or rather your story that you're telling through PR lines up with your customer, or is it just important to be authentic and let your customer come to you?
It's interesting. I think you want to tell your story in the most authentic way, but to the people that you want to be targeting.
Yeah.
Public relations has to really sync up with your marketing and with your sales.
Yeah.
Right? It has to sync up with all those strategically. So there's no point in telling your story and targeting a completely different audience. For me, as an example, I run an organization called the COO Alliance.
Yes.
Right? So I have the only network of its kind in the world for
That's
second
right.
in command, very entrepreneurial companies.
Very specific target.
Right.
You
so
talked
if I'm
to
going to tell
number
my
twos.
origin story, I'm going to talk about the entrepreneurial journey.
Right.
Right? Because I'll speak to that audience. But if I was targeting more of a corporate audience, I might talk about some of the soft skills like situational leadership or conflict management or meeting rhythms or interviewing. I might talk more skill-based or training or use some of their language. I can't even speak in that language because it's not my world. So I kind of tell my story and I lean towards my target audience, as would the rest of my marketing and my sales.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And maybe a better example than Sephora would be like Nike,
Sure.
where I think even though you might use LeBron or Serena or Venus Williams as your messenger, ultimately it's really clear in Nike that they're using them, but they're talking to you. You see yourself in the struggle or the triumph or the success of those moments in sport and athleticism through those people, and Nike allows you to see yourself in their communications and their marketing, certainly, but even in their PR, the way they wrap themselves around the Colin Kaepernick.
Yeah, they want the customer to see themselves in the story.
Yeah.
Right? So they have to speak in the feeling, like to evoke the feeling of that person.
That's right.
Right. And that's why in my origin story, I talk about this entrepreneurial journey. It speaks to the entrepreneur.
Do you find that most of your clients and most of the companies you work with, they understand this and they can embrace it? Why do we still only have, like, let's use a movie like The Founder. 3 years ago it came out.
That's the Ray Kroc movie.
That's right. The McDonald's story, right?
Yeah.
Trivia for you. Jeremy Renner, Hawkeye from the Avengers movies, is a producer on that film.
There you go.
Little bit of trivia for you there. Small budget, about $10 million, goes on to do about 50, 60 at the box office. Not a bad return. Critically acclaimed. This is the story of McDonald's.
Yeah.
Warts and all, you've got Michael Keaton playing Ray Kroc.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of other little movies along the way over the last few decades, but there's not a ton. Why? And yet that was a really successful film. People really liked it. Like, there can be an interesting story in how a company does it. Why don't more companies do things like that?
I think partially the entrepreneurial journey and success story and the entrepreneurs being the hero has only been popular for 20 years. That only started in 1998. If you go back prior to 1998, the 98, 99, 2000 was the rise of the first dot-com explosion, right? That's when entrepreneurship became cool. Then it fell hard, 2000, 2001. When the rise up to 2008 again, that's when it all of a sudden became super cool. But when I was growing up, being an entrepreneur was not cool at all. We were vilified, we were capitalists, we were greedy,
right? We
were profit-centric. Even my family didn't like what we did. Right, my other sides of our aunts and
uncles. Isn't that interesting?
So the only book prior to
the archetype was a negative one.
It was a negative one. So there was no real story. There was no narrative for the entrepreneur being cool or a hero. You think back to what's the classic movie from like the 40s, like the big titan of the newspaper magnate. God, it was like a huge movie. Anyway, it's he builds like the big castle, and it's like the fall of his whole empire. He was this greedy, profit-centric. I can't come up with the name of the movie off the top of my head, but it's based on a true story.
Yeah, and what you're describing right now would not be indifferent to HBO's Succession. Fast forward, 60 years later, and that story is truly captivating.
Well, the only book that ever had the capitalist as the hero was Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. That was really the only story where the capitalist was the hero, right? And then, other than that, it never really existed.
Do we, as an audience, do we still distrust the corporate or the entrepreneur,
sure,
the CEO?
Yeah, look what's happening now. You look at all the people that's turning against Facebook and turning against Google and turning against all the Amazon. Like, only in the last 3 years, there's this massive movement against all of these titans of like capitalism, where they were like Zuckerberg was hyper cool until 3 years ago. Sergey and Larry were hyper cool. Jeff Bezos was hyper cool. In the last 2 or 3 years, they're becoming vilified constantly.
I wonder if
that's
the network,
strange
Aaron Sorkin's
twist.
The Network, you saw that one a few years back. Do you think there's another example, did that make it worse for Facebook or better? There's a perfect example of telling the story.
I think some of the greed that's been coming out in some of the stories and some of the movies has started to make people turn against it. I think if they talked more about the struggle, if they talked the story about how hard it was for Jeff Bezos to get to the night before he became this overnight success, or how hard Larry and Sergey have worked, but they don't tell that stuff. Now it's all about, how big they all are.
Did you see the Inside Bill's Brain on Netflix?
It's fantastic.
Wow.
Right?
But you and I both know at a certain point exactly what you just said. Bill Gates was vilified. There was a antitrust decade of Microsoft being not popular.
He was a really interesting kind of specimen on PR because he had a really good PR machine that kept a lot of that stuff in the background.
Mm-hmm.
We never heard that he was a bit of a jerk. He was always driving around in his Porsche speeding. I used to joke about the story when he and Paul Allen would race to SeaTac Airport and they wanted to see who could leave the office with the least amount of time before their flight. And Bill Gates won in 28 minutes because he drove his Porsche up, tossed his keys to a valet and said, "Keep it, sell it, or park it."
Is that a true story?
That's a true story.
Oh my God.
Because prior to that, Paul Allen had done it in 29 minutes and was able to do the 1-minute run to the gate.
Really?
Yeah. So Bill Gates won by just literally giving a guy a Porsche.
Oh, if that's true, that's amazing.
A true story.
That's an amazing story. Yeah. But that three, if you haven't seen it on Netflix, you have to watch it. It's called Inside Bill's Brain. It looks at sort of Bill Gates' day and then how he got there. And to your point, the entrepreneur, warts and all, it was really compelling stuff. It lends itself to great PR, to great storytelling. And I think you're totally right. There's got to be more founders that have, you would agree, no entrepreneur has not faced adversity.
No, everyone. You think about just pick any city and then pick any company that exists. All of those would have a fascinating tale, right? There's an amazing story about every single entrepreneur in the city and most of them go untold. Mostly because the entrepreneurs are still starving for praise. I think at the end of the day, we're all 16-year-olds trapped in adult bodies. And every entrepreneur doesn't think they're doing good enough. They're still struggling. They're still trying. They're still working. And they don't think they have anything to tell because they wake up in the morning still trying to figure out how to do it.
Right.
Right. They don't even recognize that is a story. Right. Their employees would be way more apt to drive the business if they understood the hardships, if they understood what the journey was to get us to today.
One of the big success stories you have in PR in your career, and you go back almost 2 decades, is there's a moment where you dream about what would it be like if we could get this company talking to Oprah, and that moment of actualization happens, and ta-da, you pitch Oprah. Oprah hears the story, and there we go. And the simple takeaway from that is, you got to dream it first. You got to want it. And sure enough, the story was compelling, and there it was. And you make it seem so easy.
That's a little easier than the actual path. Like it was a little bit of the conceive, believe, and achieve. I'll give you a funny story though as well. My story on PR goes back to 1986. My first press coverage was 33 years ago, and the journalist Tom Hewlett just added me the other day on LinkedIn, and I was like, "Whoa, I know that name."
From that long ago.
That was 1986. I was running College Pro Painters in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada, and he covered me in the Sudbury Star, and I remember getting the article going, "This is so cool," and I showed all my potential customers, and they all thought I was like so important. And meanwhile, I just knew I was this guy who he'd seen me and asked if he could write a story. But that, for me, showed me that PR was doable for anybody. So then I fast forward to 2002, and we were standing, Brian, the founder of 1-800-GOT-JUNK, he and I were standing in the lobby at 1-800-GOT-JUNK, and we wanted to dream about what could be really big for the company. And I said, "How about our logo on the side of the space shuttle?" And he said, that's insane. Like, that could never happen.
Right, yeah.
And I'm like, why not? We could have we'd be up in space. We could be hauling away space junk. It could be sponsored by 1-800-GOT-JUNK. He's like, "That's stupid." I'm like, "Well, what do you got? Like, it's got to be really big, right?" We'd already said go from 20 to 100 franchisees. We had 20 franchisees, and we said, let's go for 100, which was ludicrous. He goes, "How about could you imagine being on Oprah?" And I'm like, "That's as dumb as being on the space shuttle." And Brian described the episode and what it would be like and how we would have this woman who was a pack rat and we'd be cleaning up her home. And he described the episode standing in the lobby of the Junction to me, and I was shaking. I'm like, wow. I mean, it's insane.
So vivid.
It's insane.
Yeah.
But it's so vivid that
and
I'm
clear.
Like, let's put that on the wall. So we put being featured
That's
on
right.
Oprah on the wall, and about 16 months later, it took us about 16 months to get it, though. We would call Oprah. I think you were either a part of the PR team at the time or you were in coaching with us at the time.
Yeah.
But we would call them, we would pitch them, we would send them letters, we sent them gifts, we'd ask for introductions, and we got shut down constantly. Oprah came walking in one day with the newspaper, the USA Today, with an article about 1-800-GOT-JUNK and said, "Have we heard of these guys? I think we should do a story with them." And the whole team started laughing, saying, "Have we heard of them? They don't stop talking to us."
That's right.
So we'd been pitching them for so long. The USA Today learned about us from a Fortune magazine article that Justin Martin had written, and the Fortune article was from a guy who read about us in Bloomberg. So we kind of laddered up the media
and
all the way to Oprah.
I love that story, and I think if I was to rename the book, I would call this The Audacity to Pitch, right?
True.
Because there is a real, what you just described, right, from when Brian visualize it and describes it to you, it's no different than someone, writing a screenplay,
Well,
writing their first script and pitching that to an executive over and over. There's so many things I think that people, even in the film and television industry, need to understand about not just conceiving the story, but pitching it.
Well, so
everything.
You were with us when we had the audacity to pitch, and you remember day when we came up with a hit list of 20 of the top 20 PR outlets that we wanted to get.
I do.
And we put a bonus in place. For each one, you'd get 200, the next you get 300, the next you get 400. And you guys, I think there was a team of 3 or 4, pooled all your bonuses together, and you split it up and divided and conquer. We landed 19 of the top 20 media outlets. And do you remember the only one we didn't get? Do you remember who it was?
It was
David Letterman.
It was Letterman,
and
wasn't it?
You guys had Bud Melman was going to go do a ride along in the truck.
That's
that
right.
was the only
but we
one
were
of the
in
20.
conversation with them.
Right.
Yeah, and that's right.
But that was the audacity to pitch. Like, we actually picked up the phone and called all these people, and they were willing to listen. And most people would never pick up the phone and do that story.
I look at, there's a series on National Geographic right now, or actually, sadly, it's been canceled, or they didn't pick it up for a 3rd season. It's called Mars. But they're within the fictional story of this future group colonizing Mars. You have the story of SpaceX. You have Elon Musk weaving the real narrative of what's happening right now today, juxtaposed over this idea of in the future where it could go. And it's this beautiful narrative where it makes you go, wow, SpaceX is incredible. You look at things like Undercover Boss. I'm not gonna give credence to that other reality show with that other guy, from many years ago, where a bunch, people compete to represent. I'm just not going to give them airtime. Okay. But there's so much right now television where we are breaking into the work environment, into the company. Do you think that's the future, whether it's reality or it's documentaries? Like, some of it, even though the founder is a fictional account of a real thing that happened for McDonald's, there is something really magnificent and raw about if you were to look inside a company and see it. And do you think that if you were to do a reality show on just about any company, there is real drama and interest in there?
Oh, there's a lot of drama and interest there, for sure. And so it's interesting you bring up SpaceX. So I've known Elon since 1995. I was a reference for him in his first round of funding with Zip2 when he had one employee. It was Kimball Musk, who used to work for me, and Elon Musk, and they had one employee, and I was a reference, and we had to back them using College Pro Painters experience for their first round of funding.
Oh my God!
Kimball, I don't know if you knew this story, but
I didn't know
Kimball. So Kimball called me that night, and he said, "I don't know what you just told Kleiner Perkins." It was only Kleiner at the time; it wasn't even Kleiner Perkins. He said, "We only asked for $600,000 in funding, and they gave us $3 million." And I didn't understand the internet, because I didn't have an email address back in 1995, and I was having to explain why to back a company that was going to be on the internet. I didn't know what the internet was. But Elon's ability to tell a story for what they were doing, to craft a story and explain that story to the media, is one of the core reasons he's been successful. He did it with PayPal. He did it with SpaceX. He's done it with Hyperloop. He has an ability to craft a story and energize people, and the media will tell that story, and then it attracts money, it attracts people, it attracts employees.
Can a company? That's an amazing story. I didn't know that about Elon. That you knew him, and
his cousin who built Solar City worked for me in '93 as well.
That's incredible. He's really an archetype that I think a lot of CEOs or business leaders should really look at. And yet, here on that vein, he's had some negative stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't think by choice, although he does project a "I don't care" to it. Do you think that PR has to be good for it to be effective? Like, if you were to, most companies don't want you to see where the mistakes have been. And I think there can be some success in trying to tell your story if you're not afraid to really be revelatory about everything happening in your company. But we hold back. We only want to tell the success. We only want to say when we overcame. The failures and the mistakes are they less impressive to the media? Should a company, is there such thing as bad PR, Cameron?
I think there's bad PR, but I think you're going to get it, so you may as well just kind of work around it. Some of Elon's bad PR was self-made. I sent a text message to his brother Kimball right after the Joe Rogan podcast went live, and I said, you need to pull him off the grid. He's losing it right now. He's really tired. He's exhausted. He's saying he's sad. And he's been pulled out of the media for the last 10 months. And I think what happened was he just was on tilt. He was sleeping on a tent in the parking lot.
Really?
Yeah. He was on tilt. He was on the roof in one building and a tent in the parking lot in another, and he wasn't getting any sleep. He was living on friends' couches. He was literally, this was only a year ago. He was just on a bit of the lunatic fringe, and you need to pull people out. So he was just making mistakes, and he was saying things that he shouldn't have said. Same thing with Chip Wilson. Chip, Lululemon, he's an amazing person. I know him really well. He's a really, really nice guy. But when
he hit some speed bumps,
he just said stuff. Like most entrepreneurs think that they can just think out loud and say what they feel, but at some point you get to be so big that maybe you can't. I think maybe we need to cut them a little bit of slack too, right? They're humans.
What about WeWork? This one is the biggest story right now going, and an example of a company that had an extraordinary valuation.
Well, and somebody we both know.
Yeah, we both know a guy who's coming to help save them and I wouldn't say turn them around, but save them.
Hopefully.
Stop the bleeding.
Yeah.
Which he, you and I both know he's very good at. But at the same time, I think because of this, there's a whole group of people who have now been exposed to WeWork who had not been to their narrative, to their story. And if for a public company, that can be a good thing. No?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of people that are hearing about it. I mean, outside of the .com or the kind of tech community, a lot of people didn't know who WeWork was, and they've gotten a ton of free press over that, for sure.
I think what I'm getting at is I think there could be a vein of PR that any company could go to after something rough has happened, something negative, whatever it is.
And telling that story.
And saying, we're prepared to let you in and walk you through how it happened and what we've learned from it. There'd be a ton of press that would go, we would love to do that.
I do it personally all the time.
Yeah, I know you do.
Because I've just chosen to just not give a shit anymore. And the only time I've actually been pulled back a little bit, my dad said, there's a couple things you've said that U.S. Customs might really not love. And I'm like, good point. Right. So I don't have to necessarily talk about everything, but I'll talk about my fears, my insecurities, my vulnerabilities, a painful divorce that I went through, struggles with business stuff, because it's real. And then all of a sudden people go, oh, you actually are a human. I'm like, yeah, like I fucking struggle too.
And you've got a podcast, and I want to mention that too, and it's got a very specific lean on it. How do you keep it interesting? And the stories you're telling and the interviews you're doing.
Sure.
How do you approach that? How do you try to keep it?
My podcast is called the Second in Command podcast, and I only interview the second in command. So everyone's interviewing the CEO. I want the rest of the story. So the example would be if we had a traditional family, husband and wife raising kids. If I was to call your mom and say, how did you raise the 5? There were 5, right? You and 4 girls.
There were 5.
How did you raise the 5 kids? Your mom would have a very true story.
Yes.
And if I called your dad and say, how did you raise the kids? He would have a very true story.
Yes, he would.
They're both married. They're still together.
Yeah.
They would have very different true stories.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Both valid. Well, no one's getting the rest of the story. So the Second in Command podcast is to get the rest of the story. We've all heard Brian at 1-800-GOT-JUNK's story of how he built 1-800-GOT-JUNK. But what about my story when I was COO, or Eric Church's story, the COO?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, right on. Well said.
So that's what I'm doing, is going after all of those second in commands.
Does it, for somebody who, so another vein there could be, is there a real avenue of PR possibility and potential for a company to not necessarily tell their narrative, but to be a platform for other narratives? Like, what you've done really well in creating your brand and your COO alliance is by being a platform for other number twos really effectively. That was really smart.
There's actually a platform for some companies to actually go kind of like reality TV.
Yeah.
But really to show the employees as well. And not just like the VPs and C-level, but what about like the payroll clerk story? Or what about the mailroom story? Or what about there's a really fascinating book from about 25 years ago, and it was called The Nudist on the Late Shift. And it was a look at all of the different roles that were played in a technology company, true stories. And the reason it was called The Nudist, I got to tell the story now.
Yeah.
So The Nudist on the Late Shift was a programmer. He was a coder, and he would sit and code. And every day at 7 o'clock, he would. Nobody else in the office except a couple of guys. He'd strip naked and he'd continue to code buck naked.
Yeah.
So one day he was tired and hadn't had enough caffeine. He looked at his clock and it said 1,700 hours. So he's like, I'll go get a quick coffee. And he strips naked and walks to the lunchroom to get a coffee. And he realizes as he gets there and the women are still there that 1,700 is only 5 p.m. So the nudist on the late shift is this guy. And that's a true story. So I think there'd be a really interesting story though to look at companies as a platform for all these other stories, to really see how do companies actually grow? How do they succeed? How do they work together? How do they get through all these problems? What about all the politics?
You're a voracious reader. I know you are. It's end of the year. Any top business books or leadership books or anything that is on your nightstand you recommend anyone? If you had to pick your top couple of the year? Which books do you like?
The two that I've been telling everyone to read now, the first one is Ben Horowitz's The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And it is an insanely good look at kind of the war of business, like really getting into the hard situations, firing people, and what mistakes you made when you had to fire them, and to looking at, it's a really introspective leadership.
Wow.
Really powerful introspective leadership book. And then the second one is Insanely Simple, and it's just a really good glimpse at Steve Jobs and Apple and how they were able to keep everything so simple, like right down to their naming conventions and the choice of wording and how everything just worked. Where you look at every other form of technology and it's confusing. Apple across the board is insanely simple.
Is your story, on that vein too, Cameron, do you think that a book is, you've written many of them, and you know the ones of the companies that are compelling and they're great stories, they're usually because they're successful companies. Can a startup write a book? I mean, to your point, you said every company has an entrepreneurial startup or a founding, and yet do you need time to go by before a book is an interesting way to tell the story?
Yeah, well, I'm actually on the board and an advisor to a company called Scribe, and they actually help businesses and owners tell stories. They help them write books. So Scribe, it used to be called Book in a Box. Founder is a guy named Tucker Max, who's one of only 3 or 4 people that had 3 simultaneous New York Times bestsellers.
Really?
And, yeah, they're amazing.
And how long have they been around?
About 3 or 4 years now. 4 years.
And they've got a book or several.
They've helped us about 500 or 600 authors write their books. 3 of my books were published by Scribe.
Right, but I mean, did they have a book about them?
Yes, they do, actually.
They do?
Yeah, and it's called Something in a Box. It might be called Book in a Box or Story in a Box, something like that. Tucker wrote it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but what I think is interesting, if you look at, like, every CEO has their story, right? They either have their struggles or their leadership lessons or how they built their culture, and it just depends on who they want to provide it to. Sometimes it's great for their customers to read. Sometimes it's good for their suppliers to understand. Sometimes it's a rallying cry for their employees. Sometimes it's also just something they need to get out.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, and we've got a really great one.
You've got
at
volumes
Vancouver
of
Film
books
School.
inside of you, of yours.
Oh, well, I mean, at VFS, our founder, James Griffin.
No, I'm talking Christopher Bennett's stories.
No.
Yeah, you do.
No, I don't think so. But I've been witness to some fascinating stuff. But I think you're right. There's sometimes opening up the journal is really, letting people in. I think that's a part of that. And you talk about this in the book too. Like there's an authenticity. There's no bullshit in this, which I really like. It's not just a catchphrase of it's free. There's a way of making reporters want more. There's a way of enticing them by just opening up the kimono and really showing them that really good stuff that I think people would take a lot from.
You know what we learned about free publicity recently that you and I didn't have the benefit of back when, I left 1-800-GOT-JUNK 13 years ago now. Facebook was just starting when I left the company.
Yeah.
So we didn't have Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter as a place to actually amplify the stories.
Right.
So now I call it the digital trifecta. So the trifecta is your earned media. So that's all the press coverage that you generate for your company. That's your earned media.
Yeah.
Your owned media is your website, your Instagram channel, your Facebook channel, your LinkedIn channel, your Twitter channel, your Reddit feeds, whatever, that you can actually take the press coverage you've got and you can put it on those pages and channels. You can link it to your website. You can have it on your press page. The third part of the trifecta is your paid media. And that's when you can actually buy traffic to those stories that are on your Facebook pages. Like imagine if we could.
Oh, I know, right?
When we were on Oprah, we couldn't even tell anybody. But imagine if we could have taken the Oprah episode, put it on Facebook, and then bought thousands of dollars of traffic towards it.
Amplification now. I know.
Crazy.
It is incredible.
So that's the power of PR now. Isn't just getting the story. It's having it tied to your SEO, tied to all of your Facebook profiles, and then amplifying it by driving traffic to it.
Does it matter where you tell your story? Do we, in your opinion, if you tell your story effectively on Facebook to a large audience, does it matter if the New York Times ever picks it up?
I guess it depends on who you want to see it. I believe in laddering up the media, so the more media coverage you get, the more that you'll get. But it depends on where your target audience is. You can also get coverage from the Vancouver Sun or the Chicago Tribune, and then you can drive everybody in New York. You can buy everybody in New York's traffic towards it if you want people in New York to see it.
Yeah.
That's the power of those kind of platforms now.
So many great films that have come out even in the last 5 years have been optioned from stories written in Vanity Fair or New York Times investigative pieces or Boston Globe. Like we see that there's a direct correlation to someone pitched this thing and took that to the reporter, handed it to it, and that reporter gave life to that story.
Sure.
And a whole bunch of great things can happen, and you get into that, which I love. Couple other questions. Do you think that social media is ultimately a platform to tell your stories, or do you think it's a platform for your audience to retell your stories more effectively? Is that a myth that can really happen effectively?
It's both. I think if you can tell your story there, that's one thing. But if you can amplify it by getting your audience and your friends to tell it and share it and comment it, that's where the amplification comes from. That's where you start putting gas on the fire.
And there's an art to that.
There's totally an art to that. That's where people like you are brilliant, is you can take kind of the rough and dirty message that the entrepreneurs or companies have, and you craft it in a way that it inspires. Right, I don't know how to do that.
We talked about I had Frank Palmer in here a while ago, and we were talking about why do political commercials suck when you compare them to traditional TV ads, which there's good and bad. But why do political ads, whether in the U.S. or Canada, just about anything, they always seem a tier behind? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, they're terrible.
Yeah. Why there's never been a more important group. I mean, they're not that different from a company or a business leader. Why still have politicians of all people failed to understand storytelling and master that their own narrative?
I think it's probably, my guess is that the advertising they're doing largely doesn't really matter. It's really about the coverage that they get, the stories that they get. It's about can they create can they create other coverage or other sound bites. I don't think it is necessarily about and we don't believe the ads.
Right.
We don't, that's the thing about advertising. We
Totally.
don't believe any of the ads we see. But if they can get a story about something they've said, and then they can drive traffic towards that story, or if they can create a story and then drive traffic, that's where Cambridge Analytica, the whole story was amazing. I talked to Carol at the main TED conference last year, just about how the manipulation of media is happening.
Fake news. Is that going to go away when the current White House occupant goes away, or is that going to kill the idea of free PR, because now we have this whole other thing that we hadn't considered before, which is the story even true?
I know. Well, I think this has actually just changed, which is sad. And I'm trying to think of the Dilbert. Who's this? Scott Adams wrote a book called Think Bigly, and it's all around basically lying that Trump is doing, or that
and Malcolm Gladwell's new one is about the same thing.
Is it? It's scary. It really is kind of scary that we're almost giving the okay to just make shit up, and then that's kind of becomes true, and that scares the hell out of me.
It's a fascinating time. Cameron, I love this book. I really strongly recommend anyone who loves storytelling and media and wants to do this better, pick it up. Where can they get it? Amazon? Can they go to your website? Where can I
Amazon, Audible, iTunes, and my main website, CameronHerold.com as well.
And are you the reader on Audible?
I'm not on this one. No.
No? Who did you get for it?
I will come into studio and do it here properly. I don't even know who I just picked a really good voice and they did a good job with it. But
that's cool.
Yeah, I looked into it and it was 2 days of my time, and I just don't feel like I have the time.
No, I think it's great.
Thank you.
The book is called Free PR, and Cameron Herold is the author. You are so great at what you do, and you really are a storyteller. And on that note, you get one of these amazing. This is
how come I get red? You get black, and I get red.
Well, the good news is it's a black and white podcast, so no one will really know.
It's like but I feel like Trump now.
Yeah, no, only if you bend the brim. Don't worry, you'll be okay.
Make red hats wearable again, right?
Yeah,
thank you.
But you really are a storyteller, an amazing guy at that, and an expert on it. So I really appreciate you doing the show.
Thank you very much.
Will you come back another time and talk to us?
I'd love to. Thank you.
Cameron Herold, author of Free PR. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, buddy.